Obrigado. And I would like to start off my presentation by thanking USP and FAPESP for facilitating this conference, and in particular to Pedro Pontoni, who a few months ago put me in touch with Maria Clara Paixão when we were organizing the Day of Digital Humanities, which I'll mention in Spanish and Portuguese, which I'll mention in a moment. And thank you very much to Maria Clara in particular and to the organizing committee for a wonderful event. Thank you very much. At first glance, the panorama for the digital humanities has never been better. There are increasingly academic spaces in the academic structures for the digital humanities, new postgraduate offerings, new posts, new professorial chairs, and the increasing attention on digital humanities has opened up old questions about the status of digital humanities, whether or not it's a discipline, what its relationship should be more broadly with digital culture and with humanities, more traditional humanities in inverted commas, and what would be the most appropriate academic model to carry out digital humanities. In a piece from September 2012, Luis Rodriguez Junta asks if digital humanities is just a label or a field which information science should engage with more seriously. And in today's presentation, what I aim to do is to explore the centres and limits of a field which has changed with relative speed, and to look at some of the main challenges which await anybody who's interested in the major social and technological and academic transformations which the digital era has brought, and in particular to look at what this means in a truly international sense. I'm going to start by responding a little bit to Luis Rodriguez Junta's question by saying that, in my opinion, there is clear substance to digital humanities. In the precursor, in the field humanities computing, which has sort of become the digital humanities in many ways. There's a rich history which many people here are probably aware of, which goes back to the beginnings with Padre Busta, people who had access to large machines, which then evolved as people started to have access to personal computers and to individual computing, people starting database projects, text analysis, concordances, then flourished with the arrival of the World Wide Web, online publishing, concepts of electronic markup, efforts to digitize cultural heritage resources, and an increasing interest in structured digital editions in humanities computing, and then moved on with the mobile era, Web 2.0, and proliferation of new devices to more of a kind of a user-generated focus and the growth of kind of social net media and connections and networks. And of course, now you can add to that now big data, linked data, and many other possibilities. The two things I would observe from these phases is that, on the one hand, the changes have been very much related to changes in technology. So digital humanities has changed much more with changes in technology than it has with changes in the humanities, and has been, whether rightly or wrongly, has been more influenced by the technical side of things. And the other issue is that, to a certain extent, and this is a criticism made within the digital humanities, sometimes we have been oblivious, or ignorant is probably too strong, but we've ignored to a large extent some of the main concerns in humanities, and we've remained a little bit distant, and that's probably been a problem in both directions. Digital humanities, as we know, has various historic features. One is that it's highly collaborative, which is very different from more traditional humanities in inverted commas. Another aspect is its concentration on constructing, on building things. Some people, like Stephen Ramsey, think that this is a central part of digital humanities. Other people disagree, but nevertheless it's part of the history. There's been difficulties in getting academic recognition and formalizing within academic structures, but digital humanities has had a major dependence, potentially a problem, a major success, potentially a very good thing, in achieving major project research funding which has brought together different humanities scholars, different people interested in information science and so on. And there's been a strong sense of community, a kind of informality, which has been very good in terms of community building and communication, but hasn't been so good on the formal academic front sometimes. And then there have also been one other aspect which I would highlight is the increasing grouping along disciplinary or interdisciplinary lines, such groups as NINES, the 19th century community of practice, or Carta, which Maria Clara kindly mentioned, which is a Spanish, it's an international network looking at the history of the Spanish language and with interest in technology. And these communities have different objectives. Sometimes they try to create tools. Sometimes they actually build peer review mechanisms. Sometimes it's simply a way of communicating. But they have been traditionally very important as well, and they have often been they have often also seen development of international standards in particular areas like epigraphy, papyrology, etc. If we're going to ask what is the digital humanities, an obvious question to ask is what is the humanities? And I don't have an answer here. I'm going to ask some difficult questions and be very unhelpful and not answer them most of the time. But I think it is important to think about, and it's in particular in international context, where I took a list of things from Wikipedia that traditionally are associated with the humanities, and the inclusion or not of these different disciplines, subdisciplines, varies a lot from country to country. Similarly, the groupings, we talked about this a little bit in the bus back to the hotel yesterday, the different groupings in different countries, different concepts of art and humanities, which is strong in the UK, liberal arts, in France, sciences humaines et sociales, and so on. This changes the way that we think about the humanities and changes the way that we think about the digital humanities. And although I think I favour a generous, an open approach to the digital humanities, we need to be aware of what the epistemological concerns of the humanities are in each country, in each region, and of the different relationships that there are, for example, with digital culture, communication studies, media studies in particular, and so on. Well, library science, and I could name 5 or 10 more. What's interesting is that in many of the debates in English-speaking digital humanities, project the digital humanities as an area which is very much connected to English. I'm thinking of Matthew Kirschenbaum's excellent article on digital humanities in English departments. But actually that's not the case in other countries. For example, a survey which Marne Dacot, who's based in France, was involved in along with other people from the Open Edition program, asked who are you digital humanists, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on. But one of the interesting results which came from the survey and the article which he wrote, the blog post he wrote, analysing this, is that actually one of the main areas which people connected to was history, not language, not literature, it was history. That's not a big surprise to somebody like me from Great Britain, where history is a very important part of digital humanities. And I'm sure if we did a survey with a different regional... this was an international survey, but it had particular biases. I'm sure if we did another survey, for example in Brazil, maybe you would come up with a different kind of focus. But that does affect the way that we perform the digital humanities, because doing digital humanities with history is very different to doing digital humanities with English, for example, or Portuguese philology. Similarly, although I think names are often a political device and are maybe not that important, nevertheless, the change, which I think I was late, unfortunately, for Daniel O'Donnell's excellent talk yesterday, but the historic change from humanities computing, digital humanities in Spanish, informática humanística, Humanidades Digitais, etc., has different political implications and also different linguistic implications. I mean, on a superficial level, humanities is a noun functioning adjectively, whereas in Spanish it's different, but also the word informatica is slightly different to computing. So these things have different implications. And although these labels, I think, are often political or personal devices, it's interesting to see the range of devices. This was analysed by Isabel Galina Russell, a member of the Mexican Association for Digital Humanities, many years ago, and it's interesting to see the evolution. If we look at the names of the official organisations, the constituent organisations connected to the international umbrella ADHO, we see that most of them use the term digital humanities in English. The Canadian Association uses the French Humanités Numériques. The European Association that I'm a part of, in fact this is old, sorry, this should be EADH, the European Association for Digital Humanities. We changed our name very recently. Until recently we were called the Association for Literary Linguistic Computing, which was completely prioritised a particular area, which for historic reasons only. But then we see other interesting developments in other countries. For example, in Germany they use the English form, digital humanities. In France they tend to use Humanités Numériques, but in Switzerland I've seen there are arguments for Frenchifying, I don't know what the term is, translating into French the English term digital humanities, Humanidades Digitais. Claire Clivaz wrote a robust defence of that option. And in Italian, interestingly, the Italian Association, interestingly, keeps the old historic humanities computing, but connects it with digital culture, which is a very interesting, I think that's a very deliberate political point. So we have all of these labels, and we have, in the last few years, the digital humanities, as we saw yesterday, the change of name has opened up the field, or opened up the area to many more people, and that's a good thing, I think. And there was a conference a few years ago in Stanford, USA, with the theme, The Big Tent, emphasizing the kind of the openness. But this openness also brings problems. And Olivier Ledeuf wrote an article last year in French, and here I give the rough translation, which is that he said that it represents a confusing territory which resembles an auberge espagnole. And I'm not. My understanding is that this is a metaphor which implies that everybody brings to an event, to the party, their own dish, their own food, their own whatever they want to bring. But he uses this to ask whether or not, in fact, it's not the digital humanities isn't a large, ill-defined space where every person can project their own desires and their own academic fantasies. Similarly, there are concerns by some people that digital humanities could be a marginalizing term. There was an article, there was a piece by Neil Smith last year again, which criticized the term digital humanities and said, well, actually, what does that mean? You know, what does not being from the digital humanities mean? Does that mean you're ridiculously out of date and traditional and analog? You know, what's the term that somebody would use if they weren't from the digital humanities? So there are kind of concerns there, and then there's an image used by David Berry in a recent presentation on critical digital humanities, where you've got this smug. It's an image which has been used many times in different ways, and he's put the text, "I do digital humanities." It's like what you do, but better, in a kind of a smug, kind of self-satisfied way, which obviously is not what we want at all. And then there are conflicting definitions of digital humanities. There's a big debate in the US earlier this year, with Stephen Ramsey again providing two definitions. And the first definition, he is more the kind of the traditional humanities computing community, which is interested in text encoding, geographic information systems, historical cataloging, visualization, with some criticism of what that means for the human record, but distinct from media studies. And then the second group, the Digital Humanities Type 2, which is a much broader group, which includes media studies practitioners, digital pedagogy practitioners, some digital artists. And Stephen Ramsey argues that this begins to not sound like a set of practices, but just the recreation of humanities after a major technological event. So that's an open. I think that's an ongoing and open debate. I did some analysis earlier this year on 3 conferences that I attended, which were 2 in Spain and 1 in the USA. The first one was from the wrong way around, from a conference in May in Navarra in Spain, which where it was interesting to see that themes of research, investigación, pesquisa, I think in Portuguese, was very important, and that's universal. Digital was very important. It's a digital humanities conference. Comunicación, communication was very important, but also revistas, journals, and bibliotecas to a certain extent are also important. I have to say that conference had a very clear academic profile, and so it specifically asked for papers on those subjects, so perhaps it's not surprising. But other conferences have a more open call. So, for example, the Spanish Language Association, there the results were, again, strong emphasis on digital, strong emphasis on data, study, research, no surprise. Libraries are a very important part there in Spain, interesting. Sociales, the social aspect. Siglo, which is probably from Siglo de Oro, the golden age, representing the fact that the host institution has a lot of research in the Spanish Golden Age. And then moving on to Nebraska, what amused me about this image was the digital humanities. The brand is very strong, it's predominant here. And other things are familiar: research, data, social, again, that's important, collaborative, scholarly, and so on. But really those 3, this is a very superficial look at the 3 conferences, and I plan to do some more detailed research. But it would be interesting to do some detailed research between languages of what the papers, what are in the paper titles, and to do comparative work over time and over geography. I already mentioned earlier on the relationship to the digital, and for lack of time I'm going to move on, but I think an ongoing concern is the relationship between digital humanities and digital culture. I leave it at there for time reasons. Moving from the disciplinary aspects, the disciplinary centres and labels and boundaries, to the academic structural issues. There's been different evolutionary paths for people engaging in digital humanities, but historically, probably in a North American and probably British setting, the trend has been from an interdisciplinary activity between departments to sometimes a computing centre, to more formal centres for computing in the humanities, which are now called centres for digital humanities. And in a few cases, well, in our case, we are formally an academic department within the School of Arts and Humanities, which is very unusual. So we have academic posts. I have an academic post. We have an academic program in masters. We have 3 MAs in digital humanities, digital culture and society, and digital asset management. And unusually, we have a PhD program, which we think is the first in the world in digital humanities. So we have PhD subjects like Oyvind Eide, who is one of our recent doctoral students who got his doctorate, did a PhD in the area, told a story, and Adam Crimble did something studying 19th century representations of the Irish using network tools. What I should perhaps mention, though, is that we've worked very hard on creating an academic program. I think the digital humanities, whatever kind of centre or grouping digital humanities has, one thing that's very important is that it needs to develop and sustain and defend its own academic program very strongly. One thing we've been very weak about, and this is a self-criticism for me too, and for people close to me, is that we haven't published a lot in the traditional sense. We've been very involved in producing digital outputs in digital projects, which we're lucky in Britain that gets recognised. In Spain, it's a different story, but in Britain, our digital outputs get recognised formally in the 5 or 6 yearly evaluation exercises that happen, but still we also need more traditional, we need to defend our time, defend our space to write more traditional publications, because that still counts for a lot in the academy, and it's still important from a research point of view. Another aspect of the structural, another structural aspect which I'm not going to talk about much today because we talked about it yesterday after the excellent presentation which Karim gave, is the relationship between digital humanities and digital libraries, the roles of publishers, libraries and academics, where all of these actors increasingly are being asked to do more and more things, self-publishing, self-archiving, but there's not a lot of cooperation in general between the way that we carry out these activities and we look at these activities, and I think that's a shame. It means overlap, it sometimes means conflict in the worst cases, and it means that we are weaker when we're representing what we do externally. Another important issue is how people's the job descriptions people have, how the work that we carried out is represented externally. We're lucky in my department because we have an academic department. We have a lot of us have academic titles, but in Britain there's this perverse distinction between in my view, between the academic staff and between research assistants who are part of the professional services grouping, which when I only discovered this when I was acting head of department 2 or 3 years ago, and I was just astonished. I really didn't understand it at all, because researchers really have a very important academic focus, and there are many other people who don't have traditional academic posts who carry out a very important academic function. This distinction has different qualities in different countries. In France they have the chercheur et ingénieur. In some Spanish-speaking countries, investigador técnico, and in the US there's kind of the OLTAC discussion. And obviously one of the key elements here are the mechanisms for credit. And there's a very interesting initiative, in fact, initiated by Adam Crimble, who I mentioned earlier on, with other people, which looks at how we might extend the authority for digital humanities research to students, researchers and contracted staff. Which also looks at the criteria for distinguishing between authorship and contribution. And also which looks at models for listing names in collaborative works. As we know in the humanities, most works are individual, and so we don't really have easy models. The kind of scientific models for collaborative work, for collaborative citation, often don't really work very well for us. And sort of developing in a similar vein was the Manifesto for Young Researchers in the Digital Humanities, which was developed in July earlier this year, and which looked at the kind of the career challenges for young researchers who are interested in the digital humanities, how we can ensure that in a moment of economic crisis and the impact that has had on academic structures, how we can defend early career researchers. And again, it looks at evaluation procedures, technical training, academic and so on. But I'm going to move on now to the more critical aspects of the international and multilingual, multicultural discussion. A very a landmark paper was produced by Domenico Fioramonte as part of the Controversies in Digital Humanities conference, which Manfred Thaler in the University of Cologne organized a couple of years ago, and which was published last year in a really wonderful volume, which has some wonderful essays in it. In that volume, Domenico Fioramonte argued that the impression of digital humanities associations and organizations internationally still remains very much of a solid Anglo-American stem onto which several individuals of mostly European countries are grafted. And this paper and some other papers produced, some other blog posts and writings produced around the same time, obviously influenced the development of Global Outlook, Digital Humanities, which Dan talked about yesterday. led to articles like Maran Dokko's article on the strategy of the Finnish sauna, which I mentioned briefly earlier on, where Maran Dokko asks, is the government of this community of digital humanities balanced and democratic, as it should be? And he comes up with some concrete proposals for people, for English speakers who talk too quickly. I'm the first mea culpa, and he suggests in international associations, in international conferences, that delegates have a white card they can raise when people speak too quickly or use particular expressions that are not internationally understood. He proposes the use of Globish, a kind of non-native global English. I have problems with that because there are actually two forms of Globish, but I understand the principle, and I'm trying to, like Dan, I'm trying to make the effort to avoid particular linguistic idiosyncrasies. And also, he proposes mechanisms to support non-native English speakers. Some of these have actually been developed as part of the Global Outlook initiative. But I think I would say that these papers are very important, and I think basically the fundamental premise is right. We need to do something about a very strong Anglo-American bias, but it's more complicated. Both the analysis and the solutions are more complicated than at first we might like to think. For example, the European Association for Digital Humanities is very definitely not dominated by Anglo-centric people. I mean, there's an important UK representation, but its bias is Northern European, something we're trying to change. But as you can see there, it is and historically has been quite different. But I think, in addition to some of the more social kind of proposals, the more kind of immediate, practical, informal proposals that have been made, we also need to look at the more formal aspects of academic production and making non-Anglophone digital humanities more visible. And for example, I think we need bibliographies of the field in various languages. We need aggregated, ideally aggregated, so that you don't have to go to different places to find the research in various fields. We need more work on the translation of key works into English from other language traditions. Again, something I know Global Outlook has been looking into. But I think we also need. We need organisations like ADHO to make sure that their resources more fully reflect. And I'm from ADHO, by the way. I'm representative in ADHO, so it's something that a note to myself as well. We need to find ways to make sure that our resources more correctly reflect the international dimension. But also, I think we need more publications in other languages about the history of digital humanities. I mean, in English there is not enough about the history of digital humanities, in my view. There's a lot being written about now and about people's perception of the now, but there's not a lot about the history, and even less in other languages. I did some research earlier this year in France, and I was really looking for works in French, and there wasn't that much, and there were some really excellent people in France. So, and the same I think it could be said of Spain and other countries as well. ADHO we have to remember, is very much of an international association. It has an alliance, it's an umbrella organisation for the traditional organisations like EADH and ACH with a more European focus, and the Canadian Society with its bilingual, bicultural focus. But recently the Japanese Association has joined the Australasian Association and Centernet. And there have been discussions with other associations in Europe, in particular the German-speaking association, French-speaking, Italian, and also other countries around the world, to make sure that it's more genuinely representative. I'm going to skip that for reasons of time. But last year, a group of us had wanted to do something about the situation in Spanish language and Portuguese language, and my background is more in Spanish language, Spanish and Spanish American studies, and I know the digital humanities history there fairly well. And it just seems that there is not enough visibility of all of the incredible research that has been carried out in the Iberian Peninsula and in Latin America. including here in Brazil, and we really needed to do something to make things more visible. So what we did was we took an event which exists every year called the Day of Digital Humanities, and it's not just in English, it's meant to be international. Some people do post it in other languages, but in practice most people post it in English. And so we decided, at least for this year, in June, that we would do a special event in Spanish and Portuguese to highlight, to create the links, to make these communities more visible. And it was a great collaboration, I must say, on a personal level between people in Spain and Portugal and Brazil and Mexico and Latin America, which I think was a model in getting different people who'd never met before to work over the internet and collaborate. And I think it was quite successful. We had about 100 people sign up, 97 people signed up, about 2/3 actually actively engaged with the blogs. There was lots of communication going on. We are planning various outputs from it, so it's going to lead to other things. The conversations were very alive, and it led to other initiatives. So, for example, there was an initiative to map the digital humanities in Spain, produced by somebody called Silvia Gutierrez. And it was, this was just a start, so as you can see, there are very few places, there are many more people in Spain involved in digital humanities that are not represented here, but this was a start. I'm being a little bit unkind to Silvia here, because this came from the day itself, but this does also highlight a problem. I think it's very important to map the digital humanities to show in visual and other ways the richness and the geographic extent of the field of the activity. But there are lots of problems associated with that. And a more controversial example, which in fact is partly what which provoked Domenico Fioramonte to write the article I mentioned earlier on, was an infographic produced by UCL in London based on data from Centernet. And Centernet, as some of you may know, is an organisation which looks for centres which are formally constituted in some way as centres in digital humanities. So it excludes, to some extent, people who may have a different name or a different function but are active in digital humanities. And of course it only includes centres that announce themselves, declare themselves and decide to be part of the Centernet network. So while these maps are can be very useful, they can give a distorted picture. This is a different example. This is from the a French map, which I believe at least was maintained more actively than some of the examples you saw earlier on. And this doesn't only show on a map the different associations, but actually gives some tabular data about the associations, the themes that they are interested in, and so on. I think there are questions here about the maintainability of this kind of resource. And another initiative in a similar vein is looking at how you gather data, how you gather information about the digital humanities, about the different people engaged in it, who may sometimes declare themselves as digital humanists, sometimes they may not. And again, Lic Ortega, and I think this was Silvia Gutierrez as well, put out a survey, a bit like the Who Are You Digital Humanist survey, in Spanish, as a result of the Dia das Humanidades Digitais, which aimed to collect information, data about the different representations. Going back to Marin Dacor's article on the Finnish Sonda, he analysed in quite a lot of detail the results of their survey, of the Open Editions survey into the digital humanities. And it was a very interesting survey, a very interesting article, which I think made a very lot of important points, but it also did show the particular bias of the people responding to the survey, and it showed the kind of people that engage with Open Edition, or the kind of people that engage with the lists which the survey was sent to. It was sent to the digital humanities lists. But there are issues here about how reliable the data that we gather is. Nevertheless, it was interesting to see there was a very high proportion of people declaring themselves from Spain, which interests me in my background, but also Latin America. I mean, the proportion in Latin America in aggregate was very similar to the proportion of people based in the US. But as I say, I think there are challenges here I think there's a difference here between a more informal survey or a more informal activity which aims to gather information to start a dialogue, and a more formal activity which we're going to use in an academic article. And there are concerns here about the reliability, the currency of the information, how up to date is it, the clear labelling. Sometimes there seems to be confusion between the country of origin of people, of digital humanists, and the country of residence, nationality. These are all different things. The languages spoken. So data really needs to be labelled very clearly if we're going to be able to use it in useful ways. And then, of course, privacy. One of the more convincing and germane mappings and visualizations of data was by Frédéric Claver, who did a visualization of the reviewers for the annual Digital Humanities Conference in 2012, which I was program chair of, so I know a little bit about it. And he showed, although I have some hope to make a response at some stage about the issues in geographic representation of reviewers, he still made the very valid point, a very important point, that the vast majority of reviewers are based in particular countries, in particular Anglophone countries. And that is something that we tried to change in 2012, and I think we're continuously trying to change, but we need to change more. So I would ask the people in this room, there was recently a query put out asking for new reviewers. If you believe you are a qualified digital humanities reviewer, please announce yourself and volunteer to be reviewer for the annual ad hoc conference. We need people who are speakers in various languages, not just English, because increasingly things are being submitted in other languages. So that's whether or not you speak English, please consider doing that. I'm going to complete my presentation by just looking at the broader impact or the broader relationship of digital humanities to questions of the future of the humanities, the future of the academy, and so on. Obviously, in a more political vein, you have the two manifestos, the Digital Humanities Manifesto 2.0, produced in the States a couple of years ago. And then you have the That Camp, Paris 2010 Manifesto for Digital Humanities, which has been translated into Portuguese, of course, and is outside these doors, and translated into, I believe, at least 10 languages. So it's had an enormous effect. Although I have to say, interestingly, sometimes at least in English digital humanities, it gets less recognition than the other manifesto, which I think is a shame, particularly since it's translated so far and wide. But all of these initiatives, the manifestos, and the discussions that are happening on various lists, point to the ongoing discussions about perspectives for the humanities and the digital humanities role. A rather strong response comes from José Manuel Lucía Mejías, a Spanish academic who wrote the excellent Elogio del Texto Digital, who argues that in that book that the humanities and universities in general have to some extent lived with their back to the society, which has given them the sense, and for which they should be a kind of intellectual vanguard and source of progress. In a similar vein, Domenico Fioramonte, in the introduction to, again, the excellent Humanidades Digitais, co-edited by him, Teresa Numerico and Francesca Tomasi, argues that humanists have often not been at the centre of diffusion of culture in recent years, neither as managers, neither as producers, nor as educators. But this crisis is also an opportunity. I think those are very valid concerns. I think they're very interesting. They're very interesting and important points to make. But I think it's a little bit more. I think some of the language that I hear in some of these presentations is a little bit too. To quote Willard McCarthy, a little bit towards the kind of techno-triumphalist nature of some aspects of the use of digital methods and technology. The reality I think, is quite complex. On the one hand, we increasingly see the pervasiveness of technology like the Apple-based model, which with its kind of walled garden model, kind of a closed platform where it's difficult or impossible to access the inner workings, a point that one of the questioners made yesterday. And the kind of contradictory model or metaphor of digital ecosystems, which is used quite a lot in the digital humanities and the wider information science. The digital ecosystem model, I think, is a very interesting. I haven't got time to go into, but I think it's a very interesting term. I think it's a very problematic term as well. I mean, if you think about the current state of the world from an ecological point of view, if you transpose that to the concept of ecosystem, I think you can get a sense of some of my concerns. But increasingly, I get frustrated when I see things reduced to a purely digital framework, a purely digital environment where everything will happen in the future digitally. It won't, in my opinion. It won't at all. What we'll continue to see is transfer between various different digital containers, but also non-digital containers. I remember when I was involved in the Out of the Wings project a couple of years ago, we produced what we thought was a very sophisticated research, digital-based research workflow, and some of the researchers just didn't want to use it. And maybe that was a problem of communication on our part. Maybe it was a cultural issue that they didn't want to work more digitally, but maybe it was just that it wasn't right for them. Maybe it's just that we don't want to work digitally all the time. I don't like to read digitally. I don't like to work. I take a lot of what I do out of the digital medium, put them in non-digital containers, and put them back again. And I think a major challenge for us in the coming years will be how we manage that in a way that doesn't provide incredible loss, intellectual loss. Another aspect is the contradiction between stability and innovation. And again, Willard McCarty makes this, the point that, well, on the one hand, we have the need to provide, to use standards and to use digital technology, which we will be able to access in 10, 50 years' time. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that computing is an ever experimental, ongoing process. And we have this concept of the trading zones, which McCarty and Svensson, Patrick Svensson among others, talk about, quoting Peter Galison, and kind of issues of loss of translation, which I won't go into for lack of time. So I'm going to end again with the quote that I started off with by Luis Rodriguez Yunta, because I think his piece gives a very good summary of where I think the digital humanities can play a role. On the one hand, he emphasizes the role of humanities in being a kind of a check on the information society, a kind of intellectual and political check on reality check on the information society. The permanent reflection about its own epistemology, which in the digital humanities sometimes gets a little bit tiring because we've been hearing these discussions for many years, but is nevertheless very important. And finally, the connotation of humanities or the humanists in defense of the human, and a possible concept of the humanization of technology, which we mustn't lose. So I would end by saying that for me, humanities and digital humanities are not opposing concepts. They should not be traditional humanities, and digital humanities should not be seen as opposing concepts, but quite the opposite. The humanities offers us an excellent means of looking critically to the past, and digital humanities offers us an excellent way of looking critically towards the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I would like to make a few comments and then open for the debate. I think Paul's speech, for which we are very, very happy to hear today, focuses on some points, many important points, and I would like to highlight one. And to be coherent with the whole of his speech, I will highlight it in Portuguese. No? Because he's been here for 24 hours and so he has already learned. No? Do you understand me if I say, well, no? I'll try, yeah. O que para mim ficou muito forte na fala do Paul hoje é uma coisa que eu acho que muitos de nós que estamos aqui tentando trabalhar nesse campo estamos sentindo, que é a importância de entender as humanidades digitais, o foco de humanidades digitais como uma comunidade de práticas. Do you understand me? Como se quiser isso. Como uma comunidade de práticas. E isso eu achei muito forte na parte da fala dele, que eu anotei em letras garrafais aqui, que no Reino Unido os produtos digitais dos trabalhos dele são reconhecidos como trabalho acadêmico. Ele falou, não é assim em todos os lugares. Bom, nós que estamos aqui sabemos que no Brasil, por exemplo, não é assim. Nós podemos até produzir corpora eletrônicos ou bibliotecas digitais ou o que quer que a gente produza, isso não é reconhecido como trabalho acadêmico para um professor, para um pesquisador brasileiro. Então, quando a gente faz esse tipo de trabalho, a gente faz, muitas vezes, até com uma certa culpa de não estar trabalhando, porque a gente devia estar fazendo alguma coisa que ia contar. Vocês sabem qual é a situação que eu estou falando. Então, isso me leva a pensar que a forma de trabalho nas humanidades digitais é que é o que mais diferencia de outros rótulos de humanidades que a gente pudesse dar. Um segundo aspecto em que isso fica claro é quando o Paul mencionou todas essas associações e atividades que também ontem o Daniel mencionou, que funcionam como comunidades virtuais, listas de discussão, listas de e-mails, as próprias pesquisas sobre onde estão os centros em humanidades digitais são feitas virtualmente e muitos de nós às vezes não participamos, não é só a barreira linguística, é porque nós não temos tanta disponibilidade do nosso tempo para estar nas listas e etc. E quando estamos e quando tentamos participar, sempre tem um colega que vem e pergunta, mas por que você está fazendo isso em vez de trabalhar? E é um momento de trabalho, porque é um momento em que você está interagindo com a comunidade de práticas. Então, como é uma comunidade de práticas que funciona de uma forma muito diferente, a depender do grau de tradicionalismo, em termos institucionais mesmo, das humanidades nos diferentes lugares, o engajamento dos pesquisadores também vai poder ser diferente. Então, às vezes eu tenho a impressão que, além da questão da língua e da questão das diferenças culturais em outros aspectos que vocês estão discutindo, me dou conta, com a sua fala, que também influencia bastante as diferentes maneiras em que a academia é organizada em cada lugar. Então, achei muito interessante observar como em outras regiões existe, me parece, ao ouvir o Paul, uma organização mais porosa, mais permeável a novas formas de trabalho. E isso eu acho muito forte. E eu acho que é importante para nós refletirmos aqui, talvez na academia, no Brasil. Né? Era apenas um resumo de uma coisa que me pareceu importante. I don't know if you would like to react to that, but or yeah. Otherwise I'll give the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of quick points. Yes, I think what you say resonates a lot with, for example, the situation in Spain, where at the recent HDH conference, one of the main issues that came up was that the association needs to be in dialogue with the national research evaluation body and to pressurize them to change their policies. And I mean, it has to be said, no country's perfect. In Britain we're relatively lucky. And for example, in the last research evaluation exercise, we mostly submitted digital outputs, projects, not papers, not monographs. But there are challenges, even in a relatively fortunate scenario like that. But obviously, these things need a transition and need pressure, need political pressure. The other thing I would mention is that sometimes the communities of practice, like NINES, for example, has a peer review mechanism. But also, there's a very interesting project network community around papyrology, which we've had a little bit of involvement with, but which is basically based in Heidelberg, Germany, Duke, in the US, and New York, which actually creates, as well as being a kind of community practice and having a standard and providing markup tools, they provide an actual mechanism to carry out peer review which marries, which merges the traditional scholarly concept of peer review with more kind of social concepts of social review, more familiar with through social media. And that is obviously that may have its political costs in the short term, but it's an interesting model. It's a project I'm very interested in, and so yes, I think those two activities are ways that we can challenge this problem.
Yes, thank you. Maybe there are questions over there. So, any questions? Kathleen.
I actually wanted to follow up on that point. There's really probably two things to keep in mind, and as Paul was saying, it varies very much from country to country. So the English system, for example, has the National Research Board that you need to report to, and then that needs to be lobbied. In the Canadian situation and the American situation, and I don't know the situation in Brazil, the problem also has existed. It's getting better, but it's a much more local thing. And so the solution there, we have had the same issue where lobbying has been involved with the national funding agencies, but we haven't had to talk to a national quality assurance board to have digital work recognized. What we've had to do there is insist to our colleagues that it needs to be recognized. So the big problem, for instance, in the United States is that people come up for tenure and they're doing digital work, and their colleagues in the department are simply not recognizing it, or their deans are not recognizing it. And you can do something about both of those issues, and in the context of discussing, a Portuguese language digital humanities societies, we're thinking about that because that is an important role. One course of action which is easy to do in some sense, but a little bit scary to do, is to recognize the extent to which whenever you have collegial approval processes, you are the colleagues. And one of the things that you have to do is you almost have to become an advocate. We've had to do that in Canada, where people then really have to push. The moment you're on one of these committees, you have to say, no, this works good, and you really just have to become an advocate. But the second part is really to work quite hard at lobbying the groups. And I know in Canada we use the Canadian Society for Digital Humanities to do that. So it isn't. We're not powerless in this regard, but you can do a fair bit with concerted action, where you just, if it is the case that you have to do it on a collegial route, to really discuss amongst yourselves, not that you're going to be a cartel, but that you are in fact going to almost be a cartel, and start promoting digital work. And then if it is the question of the national board, that you plan a program of lobbying, that you don't leave it to chance, but that you actually discuss in advance what you're going to say when you meet people, and you can do it.
Thank you, Dan.
Vou falar em português. Paul, queria que você vai... I'm gonna speak in Portuguese.
Yeah, okay.
Eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho mais sobre o programa de doutorado que vocês criaram nas Humanidades Digitais. Eu fiquei curioso em saber como é que vocês construíram a base teórica, digamos assim, do programa, e também do ponto de vista das metodologias de pesquisa que vocês estão utilizando. E se eu entendi corretamente, você disse que já existia um programa na área de cultura digital e sociedade, não é isso? Então, qual que seria a diferença entre esse programa que já existia e o programa que vocês criaram? Obrigado.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, what I should have explained better is that at King's we have Digital Humanities, which has been an academic department since around 2001, but changed its name 2 years ago. But we also have another department called CMCI, Creative Media and Cultural Industries, which was also created around 10 years ago, has its own master's program. We share the MA in Digital Culture and Society with them. That's a joint master's between the two departments, and we're both in the School of Arts and Humanities. So we're lucky in that we, for us, the kind of the Digital Humanities, Digital Culture relationship is managed quite well by the fact that we have these two groups. I mean, CMCI has a particular focus on things, but that's natural. Any department has its own intellectual focus. As far as the PhD is concerned, it grew because it's been led by Professor Willard McCarthy all the way through. He still leads it. He's semi-retired, but he still leads it now. It developed a few years ago because one of our MA students really, really wanted to do a PhD and said, look, please, how can I do a PhD? And so Willard said, well, okay, you really want to do a PhD? Let's explore what that would mean, how that would work. And the PhD program is very different probably from other PhD programs in the humanities in the sense that, and this could be viewed as a positive thing or a negative thing, but it's developed from demand. So traditionally in other departments in King's, I'm sure it's true in most other places, traditionally you have academics who are known for particular things and people gravitate towards those particular academics looking to do doctorates. That's at least that's the model that we're familiar with. DDH is different. I think that will change, and in fact it needs to change because we have a debate about the difference between our research program and our teaching program, which probably needs to be. We've probably tried to do a little bit too much in the past. We've done a lot of projects. I mean, dozens of projects, and with lots of funding, and they've been very positive. But I think now we are looking to be much more focused and to connect the PhD program with the master's program. We're going to do a new undergraduate program very soon with the other department, CMCI, and to connect those much more with the research. But in the past, we had very few academics and a lot of people with research posts. That started to change 2 years ago, and so we started to move more towards this more traditional model. I think we'll want to have a hybrid because sometimes people come with a really interesting idea, but then the problem you have then is that it's a nice problem in some ways, but most of our PhD students are joint PhD students with another department. So joint with history, joint with English, and sometimes the joint supervisors are in other institutions. Occasionally that happens, and administratively that is very complicated. So that has administrative challenges. But I think the PhD program so far has developed along those lines. As I say, I think it'll probably move more in the direction of a more traditional kind of model. But still, your question about methodologies is very germane because even if it's more focused in particular areas, what methodologies do you choose? And often they are very general methodologies about collaborative research. You can't do for a PhD program with maybe 10, 20 people when one person's doing network analysis, somebody else is doing text modeling, someone else is doing GIS. Technically, you can't come up with a single theme. If one person's doing English, another person's doing Portuguese literature, another person's doing Spanish history, then you can't come up with a humanity. So they need to be quite. They're kind of general skills about our relationship to technology. Perhaps is one of the key things, and collaborative research. Those are the kinds of areas where you would see common methodologies, but often we have to develop something very, very specific for each PhD student. That's the challenge.
Hello. Fine? Yes. Thank you very much. I like very much the talk. You have mentioned the concept of trading zone in Gallison's book, Image and Logic. Gallison tried to, in his book, he shows how a new discipline, high energy physics, appeared thanks to the collaboration among many scientists who came from many disciplines, mathematics, physicists who even were theorists, experimentalists, instrumentalists. There were also engineers. They were all collaborating to build the H-bomb in the post-war era. I wonder, and the same concept of trading zone has been used by Susan Leigh-Starr in the University of California. She created the concept of boundary object. It's almost the same. Boundary object is almost the same as trading zone. And I wonder how these concepts, which are the trading zones and the boundary objects of digital humanities. I mean, objects that mean specific things for every practitioner, for engineers, for humanists, and also they also have a general meaning, so that they can share those concepts and understand each other when they practice, when they do things in digital humanities. Do you heard about some? Is anybody working on this, or do you have an idea of what could be this boundary object or these trading zones?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think the first time I read Peter Gallison's work being quoted was in I didn't read it in 1999, but it's a piece by Willard McCarthy in 1999. And then Patrick Venson also mentioned it later on in his series of articles on digital humanities for the Digital Humanities Quarterly. And I think the attraction from a digital humanities point of view is it explains how different disciplines, different scientific areas can come together and can try and find a common language where, if you speak with, even if I speak with somebody from information science and we have a strong representation of information science in DDH, a really strong group, the language is a little bit different. Or if I talk on a non-academic level with our developers, I know a little bit about programming, but I'm not a programmer. And if I talk with the developer, we speak different languages, and we kind of understand each other, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes sometimes we think we understand, and we don't. So obviously, the attraction of this concept is that it helps us to think about how something as interdisciplinary as digital humanities can negotiate all of these different languages. And I think that the concept of one of the concepts that came out of Gallison's work was this idea of a pidgin language which develops. A kind of where people don't, and it's not a situation where everybody understands everybody all the time, but you develop common ways of communicating. In terms of the boundary objects, I think I'm not sure I have a very good answer to that, because I think partly this problem of the field dispersing, the field becoming ever more. I think there was a time when that was much clearer, and I think now it's an interesting question. I think it's difficult to define something very specific, speaking about the digital humanities internationally.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think I will have to be very authoritarian, because this has been a very, very motivating session, and maybe Karim could just react if you want, but then I would like to say we would close this first session and start the project session. Yes? It needs to be turned on.
When you were answering, I thought that perhaps these trading zone could be the metadata, perhaps. I mean, where people, scientists, scholars from different disciplines or different humanists, engineers, information scientists could share metadata so that to understand each other. I mean, the metadata would be the Creole or the Pidgin languages, right? Where they try to understand each other and share concepts so that to keep developing what you were talking, building something, right? Digital humanities is to build something. So that to build like the H-bomb, like physicists try to build the H-bomb and try to understand each other, physicists, mathematicians, engineers, this would be, could the metadata be this kind of trading zone where we try to understand each other? We are reducing different disciplines, arts, etc., to metadata?
Quite possibly, and as you were talking, I was thinking also some of the common methodologies that have been developed with the digital humanities could be another, but yeah.
Common ground. Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody and Paul Spence again.